Faith can move mountains, they say, but in my experience, it's usually money that does the heavy lifting. I learned this lesson the hard way, watching my life savings disappear into the divine vision of my in-laws' expanding religious empire. Another blessed Sunday, Robert Matthews announced from his gleaming pulpit, his voice carrying perfectly through the state-of-the-art sound system I'd helped finance. The Lord continues to show us the way forward, showing us how to grow His kingdom through our New Life Community Church. From my seat in the third row, I could see every detail of the newly constructed worship center, the custom stained glass, the imported marble floors, the advanced lighting system that created the perfect ambience for both traditional services and contemporary worship. All paid for with faith investments from the congregation, including my own $300,000 contribution. My husband David squeezed my hand, beaming with pride as his father continued preaching. He truly believed in his parents' mission, never questioning where all the money went or why the church needed so many expensive upgrades. But I'd been raised by an accountant mother and a businessman father. Numbers were my native language, and these numbers weren't adding up. Sarah, Grace Matthews, my mother-in-law, touched my arm as the service ended. Would you join us for lunch? Robert has received another vision from the Lord of the church's future. I suppressed a sigh. These visions always seemed to coincide with requests for more money, but I smiled and nodded, watching Grace glide away to greet other congregants. At 62, she was the perfect pastor's wife, elegant, poised, and absolutely convinced of her husband's divine calling. Isn't it exciting? David whispered as we walked to our car. Dad says this next phase will transform the whole community. I thought about the community that actually needed transforming, the struggling neighborhoods just blocks from our gleaming megachurch, where families couldn't afford basic necessities while we installed gold-leafed decorative crosses. The Matthews home was as impressive as their church, a sprawling mansion paid for by the pastoral housing allowance that the board of directors, all handpicked by Robert, had approved. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the dining room table where Grace's housekeeper had laid out a perfect Sunday lunch. The Lord has been so good to us, Robert began once we were seated. Our congregation grows every week, but with growth comes responsibility, a calling to do more, to build more, to reach more souls for His kingdom. I took a bite of perfectly roasted chicken, waiting for the other shoe to drop. We've been blessed with an opportunity, he continued, eyes shining with what he probably thought was divine inspiration. The Anderson property next to the church, 30 acres of prime land. Perfect for our next expansion. Expansion? I couldn't help asking. The new worship center isn't even fully paid off yet. Grace's smile tightened slightly. Sarah, dear, we must trust in God's timing. When He opens a door, we must walk through it in faith. The Andersons are asking $5 million, Robert added. A steal, really, given the location. We've already raised half from some of our most dedicated members. I felt David tense beside me, knowing what was coming. Sarah, Robert leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used during donation drives. We know God has blessed you with financial wisdom. Your investments have done so well since you joined our family. Perhaps this is His way of showing you how to use those blessings for His glory. My investments had done well because I had spent years studying markets, making careful choices, building a portfolio that would secure my future, the future that now seemed to be slipping away into endless church expansions. I've already contributed significantly to the worship center, I reminded them gently, and my business is at a critical growth phase right now. My online financial consulting firm had been thriving, helping small businesses and individuals manage their money responsibly. The irony wasn't lost on me. But this is different, Grace insisted. This is about legacy, about building something eternal. Surely your business can wait when God is calling. I looked at David, seeing the conflict in his eyes. He believed in his parents' mission completely, had grown up watching them build their ministry from a small storefront church to this massive operation. But he also knew how hard I'd worked for my success. We should pray about it, he suggested, trying to find middle ground. Robert seized the opening. Of course, prayer is essential, but time is also a factor. The Andersons have other interested buyers. We need to move quickly to secure God's chosen property. How quickly? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The board meets Tuesday to approve the purchase. If we can show strong financial backing from key families like yours, it's a sign that God is confirming this direction. 2 days. They were giving me 2 days to decide whether to sink more of my life's work into their endless expansion plans. I'll need to review my finances, I said carefully. Look at the numbers. Numbers? Grace laughed lightly. Sarah, dear, this isn't about numbers. It's about faith, about trusting God's plan. But as I drove home that evening, numbers were exactly what occupied my mind. The $300,000 I'd already invested in the worship center. The promises that it would be repaid from future tithes that somehow never materialized. The way church financial reports were always long on praise but short on specific details. You're awfully quiet, David observed as we got ready for bed. Just thinking about your father's vision, I replied. And about something my dad used to say. God helps those who help themselves, but con men help themselves to those who don't check the math. David frowned. Sarah, you're not suggesting. This is my father we're talking about. A man of God. A man who drives a Mercedes and lives in a mansion while preaching about heavenly treasures. I couldn't help pointing out. The church provides those things so he can focus on ministry without worldly concerns. David recited the familiar explanation. I decided to try a different approach. Remember when we first got married and you talked about your dream of opening a youth center? Working directly with kids in need? His face softened. The Hope Heaven Project. But Dad said the church needed to focus on growth first. That we can't help others until we're strong enough ourselves. And how many years ago was that? How many expansions and upgrades and new properties have happened since then, while that dream stays on hold? He was quiet for a long moment. You really think something's wrong with the church finances? I think it's time we looked closer at where all this faith investment money is actually going. The next day, I called in some favors from my professional network. A real estate agent friend who could check property records, an accountant colleague who specialized in nonprofit audits, a private investigator who owed me for helping him restructure his debt. What they found sent me down a rabbit hole of shell companies, hidden accounts, and carefully concealed transactions. The pastoral housing allowance was just the tip of the iceberg. That night, I spread the documents across our home office desk, waiting for David to return from his evening meeting with the church board. My hands shook slightly as I reviewed the evidence one more time. The front door opened at 9:30 p.m. David's footsteps in the hallway, then his sharp intake of breath as he saw what covered my desk. Sarah? What is all this? The truth about your father's divine visions, I replied, turning to face my husband. And about where our money, all the congregation's money, has really been going. David stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the papers spread across my desk. Property records, bank statements, corporate filings, the paper trail of years of financial manipulation disguised as divine guidance. Start with this one, I said quietly, handing him a document. He took it with trembling hands. What am I looking at? Look at the current owner. It's not the Anderson family. They sold it 6 months ago to a company called New Life Holdings LLC. I don't understand. New Life Holdings is owned by another company, Blessed Ventures Corporation, which is owned by Kingdom Investments Partners. I laid out the chain of shell companies, each one leading back to a single source, all ultimately controlled by your father. David sank into a chair. That's impossible. Dad said the Andersons just agreed to sell. He already owns the land, David. Has owned it for months. He paid $2 million for it. Now he wants to buy it for the church for $5 million. The extra $3 million, that would go straight into his pocket, laundered through these shell companies. No, he shook his head violently. There has to be some mistake. My father would never. I handed him another stack of papers. The new worship center budget. See these contractor payments? They're all to companies that don't exist. The real work was done by firms charging half as much. The difference was funneled through fake companies into private accounts. But the board, they review all the finances. The board your father personally selected. Look at their connections. I spread out more documents. Each one has received consulting fees or ministry stipends through similar arrangements. They're all complicit. Tears were running down David's face now. The pastoral housing allowance is 3 times what's reported to the congregation. The real numbers are hidden in a maze of property management companies and ministerial trusts. He looked up at me, his world crumbling. Why? Why would he do this? Because people trust him, because God's vision is the perfect cover for financial fraud. Who questions a man of God? Who dares to doubt divine guidance? All those years, David's voice broke. All those projects he said we couldn't fund because the church needed to grow first. My youth center dream was less profitable than endless expansions and upgrades. I finished gently. Real charity doesn't generate kickbacks. He stood suddenly, pacing the room. We have to stop him. The Anderson property deal, we can't let him steal more money from the congregation. We can do more than stop him, I replied, pulling out my phone. Remember that investment opportunity I told him I needed to review? I showed him the screen, a confirmation email from my bank. His eyes widened as he read it. You bought the controlling interest in New Life Holdings through my own chain of shell companies. Your father doesn't know it yet, but I now effectively own the land he's planning to buy for the church. So when he tries to push through the purchase Tuesday, he'll find out the land has a different owner, one who's ready to expose everything unless he agrees to some major changes. The next day was Monday. I spent it preparing, gathering more evidence, making careful arrangements. David spent it wrestling with his conscience and his faith. It's not just the money, he said that evening. It's all the people who believed in him, who sacrificed their savings because they trusted his visions, which is exactly why this has to stop. Tuesday dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully for the board meeting. Conservative suit, minimal jewelry, nothing to suggest I was about to destroy an empire built on sacred lies. Robert Matthews stood at the head of the conference table, confident in his perfectly tailored suit. We're gathered today to approve a significant step forward in God's plan for our ministry, he began. The purchase of the Anderson property represents. Excuse me, I interrupted politely. Before we continue, I have some documents the board should review. Grace shot me a warning look. Sarah, dear, we have a specific agenda. Yes, we do. I started distributing folders to each board member. An agenda of fraud, money laundering, and exploitation of religious faith for personal gain. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as board members opened their folders. Robert's face darkened. These accusations are ridiculous, he thundered. I won't sit here and let you slander God's work. God's work? I stood, my voice carrying clearly. Is that what you call buying land through shell companies and reselling it to your own church at inflated prices? Is that what you call skimming millions through fake contractor invoices and inflated budgets? The board members were flipping through their folders with increasing agitation. Each one found documents detailing their own complicity. The kickbacks, the consulting fees, the carefully hidden payments. I have copies of everything, I continued. Bank records, property deeds, corporate filings, every shell company, every hidden transaction, every dollar stolen from people who trusted you with their tithes and offerings. Robert's face had gone from red to white. You have no right. Actually, I do. As the new controlling owner of New Life Holdings, I have every right to question how church funds are being used to buy property I already own. Grace gasped. Robert grabbed the property documents, scanning them frantically. Impossible. The ownership transfer was completed last week through the same kind of shell company arrangements you've been using for years. Amazing how that works, isn't it? David stood up beside me. It's over, Dad. All of it. Son, Robert's voice turned pleading. You don't understand. Everything I did was for the ministry. No, David's voice was firm. Everything you did was for yourself. The mansion, the cars, the hidden accounts, while people in our congregation struggled to pay their bills, while kids in our community needed help, while my own dreams of actual ministry were put on hold so that you could build your empire. The board members were shifting uncomfortably, some already edging toward the door. Here's what's going to happen, I announced. First, every penny taken fraudulently from this church will be repaid, with interest. I have forensic accountants ready to track every transaction. You'll destroy everything, Grace cried. The church will never survive this scandal. The church isn't buildings or property or expansion plans, David replied. It's people. People whose trust we need to restore. I laid out the terms. Robert and Grace would retire immediately. All church assets would be transferred to a new board of directors, legitimate community leaders with actual oversight power. The mansion and luxury cars would be sold, with proceeds going to establish the programs the church should have been funding all along. And if we refuse, Robert's voice was cold. Then every document in those folders goes to the FBI, the IRS, and the media. Your choice. They chose survival over prison. Within a month, New Life Community Church had been transformed. The massive worship center was partially converted into a homeless shelter. The Anderson property became the site of David's long-delayed youth center. Real financial transparency replaced vague appeals to faith and divine guidance. Some congregation members left when the truth came out, but most stayed, relieved to see their church finally focusing on actual ministry instead of endless expansion. The new board implemented strict financial controls and regular audits. Every dollar donated could now be tracked to its final use. Robert and Grace moved to a modest condo, humble but not homeless. The justice system might have put them in prison, but true redemption required them to live with the consequences of their actions while working to make amends. David struggled with forgiveness, with reconciling the father he'd idolized with a man who'd exploited faith for profit. But leading the new youth center helped heal those wounds. Watching troubled kids find hope and purpose gave him back his own sense of calling. "You know what's ironic?" he said one evening as we watched teenagers playing basketball in the center's new gym. "Dad always talked about divine guidance, but he never recognized it when it actually came." "What do you mean?" He was so focused on buildings and money that he missed the real miracles, lives being changed, people being helped, community being built. The very things we're doing now that he could have been doing all along. A year later, I attended another Sunday service at New Life Community Church. The crystal chandeliers and gold decorations were gone, replaced by simple, dignified furnishings. The sound system was modest but functional. The massive LED screens had been donated to the youth center. But the building was fuller than ever. People weren't there for the spectacle anymore. They came for the genuine fellowship, the transparent ministry, the real-world impact they could see in their community. During the financial report, every donation and expense was clearly detailed. The new pastor, a humble man who lived in a regular house and drove a used car, encouraged questions and discussion about church finances. "You could have just exposed them," Grace said quietly from the pew behind me. "Sent them to prison. Why give them a chance to make it right?" "Because this was never about revenge," I replied. "It was about restoration, about turning something corrupt into something genuine." She was silent for a moment. Robert and I, we lost our way, convinced ourselves we were serving God when we were really serving ourselves. "Thank you for stopping us before we lost everything, including our souls." The offering basket passed down our row. I watched people give generously, confidently knowing their gifts would be used as intended, not for mansions and luxury cars, but for feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, helping the hurting. Faith can move mountains, they say. But sometimes faith needs help from clear eyes, careful accounting, and the courage to stand up against those who would exploit it. The miracle isn't in grand buildings or expensive expansions. It's in lives transformed, hope restored, and truth prevailing over deception. David's Youth Center flourishes, a testament to what ministry can be when it's built on genuine service rather than greed. The troubled teens who find mentorship and purpose that don't care about marble floors or stained glass windows. They care about having adults who truly listen, who show them a better path, who demonstrate that faith is about action, not acquisitions. Robert sometimes visits the center, watching quietly from the sidelines. Perhaps he's remembering his own early days in ministry, before the lure of wealth and power corrupted his calling. Perhaps he's finally learning what divine guidance really looks like, not in visions of grand expansions, but in the simple act of helping others. The Anderson property, once meant to be another monument to excess, now grows vegetables for the church's food bank. Congregation members tend the gardens alongside community residents, sharing stories and building relationships that no amount of money could buy. Every dollar I spent buying that land has been repaid 1,000 times over in the joy of seeing it used as it should have been all along. Not for profit or prestige, but for genuine ministry that changes lives. Faith, I've learned, doesn't require grand edifices or expensive trappings. It requires truth, transparency, and the wisdom to know the difference between divine guidance and human greed. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply standing up for what's right, even when it means challenging those who claim to speak for God. The miracle isn't in the money, it's in the transformation that happens when that money is finally used for its intended purpose. In the lives renewed, the hope restored, the community rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than deception. That's an investment that pays eternal dividends.